That's never going to get old.
And I keep the volume turned all the way up in my headphones just so I can stand out to it. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of In Black and White here on YFNA News. I'm your host, Rick Lockhart.
And I am Ethan Micheal. I remember that time.
Yes, you did. And for those of you, Ethan pointed out earlier, if you happen to notice there's a different spelling of my name, it's intentional. I did not forget the K. We're trying something a little different.
I had to just ask him in the green room if he did forget or spell his name wrong.
You know what? I'll work on that. All right, baby steps. It's a big change in my life, and I'm just trying to walk through it. You know, I had my therapy session today. Shout out to TMH Behavioral Services. Also, they are not providing contribution for me to say that. I just wanted to shout them out because of the outstanding job that they're doing to help me through my mental health care. And so as I'm going through this, my baby steps, Ethan, bear with me, all right? Appreciate that. Hey, so a lot to dive into tonight, as always. A couple of things that we want to cover before we get started, just to give some of those updates. We've been talking about Breonna Taylor and keeping things updated as best as we can. And here's the update. There is none. We're still waiting for movement to happen with these police officers, man. We're still waiting for, I think, that was as of earlier yesterday. I don't think I've had a chance to take a look at anything that has come up, but I don't think that it's still enough at this point. So we still need justice for Breonna Taylor. Keep that at the forefront too as well. I believe things are progressing along with the case with Ahmaud Arbery's killers. So there's that. A lot going on in the news, but before we get into any of that, I do have to extend an apology to the mayor and the city of Aurora, Illinois, as we spoke about the McLean story last week, Elijah McClain's story last week. I indicated in the show that it was Aurora, Illinois, and it is in fact Aurora, Colorado. I'm honored that the mayor of Aurora, Illinois, watches our show. Shout out to you, sir, because he's a really outstanding gentleman. At least from I've never interacted with him directly, but from the things that I've seen and the direction that he's gone, he even did a ceremony for my sister sorority of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, honoring their centennial celebration this year. So shout out to you. So thank you so much for watching. And I apologize that we indicated it's Aurora, Illinois, because you're doing great things in that city. So wanted to make sure we clarified that. You know, so Ethan, I don't know if you've been watching the things that have gone on around that case. At this point, the officers, I believe, have been placed on leave, I believe. And, you know, I think that this is the power of having conversations and bringing awareness, right? That we have opportunities to keep people on track and kind of up to date with what's going on. And hey, if you like the things that we're doing, make sure that you subscribe to our channel at YFNA News on YouTube. Like this video and hit the alert button when you subscribe to the channel so that you can get updates and notifications for when we go live, when all of our shows go live.
And if you really like us, you can subscribe to our Patreon for as low as $1 a month, up to $5 a month. And all that goes into improving the quality of the show, you know, flyers, advertisements, everything we can do to provide you the best and most accurate information possible with the best quality show.
And that's important. So if you are able, please click on that link. Is the link in the link's in the post in the
description? Yeah, there's options. They've got the Patreon, so they can subscribe to $1 to a $5 a month plan. And there's the, hey, you had a good show, but let me buy you a coffee link. So you can click that as well.
And I do drink black coffee just in case anyone does want to buy coffee. Do you drink coffee even?
I do not drink coffee. Do I not look wired enough as it is?
Well, we appreciate that wiredness. And I think, you know, with our conversation tonight, we do have a special feature or some joining guests later on in the show. We will be continuing probably for the bulk of the night. All of our shows tonight will be addressing something very similar. So tonight we will be covering attacking white supremacy, and we're going to talk about what voting looks like and how to identify those characteristics and traits in policy and in candidates. And then our sibling show, the 13%, will actually be on right after us. They'll be joining us in the last few minutes of our show to kind of talk about to discuss what they'll be talking about this evening, but they'll be covering institutional and systemic racism. Ethan, there have been so many people that I've crossed paths with who don't seem to believe that systemic racism is really a thing.
So I think I'm starting to understand why they think that, because I believe if we're gonna, I don't want to point out a specific group, but I'm going to, the conservative right, from their stance, they figure, well, we eliminated all the laws that are directly stopping the Black community, therefore it can't exist. So I'm
with you.
We got to find a way to improve our dialogue with them and get through to them to make them see what's really going on here.
Maybe we can get someone from that community or identified group on In Black and White.
I know one that I think would be a good addition, someone we could talk to.
I think that might be a cool thing. Hey, let me ask you a question. And for those of you who are viewing, if you happen to identify as white American or European American, we talked about that last week too. Wondering, Ethan, have you ever had to identify your race or how often do you have to identify your race on applications or when you fill out forms? How often is white or Caucasian American listed? Is it listed pretty often?
In the last job application I filled out a couple years ago, yeah.
I mean, I know it's on the census.
I never actually really had to think about it. It's just like a default for me. Like, oh, okay, cool. And I think that's the privilege people speak about. I don't ever have to think about being white.
And that's the thing when we talk about race, and I think I've mentioned this before on the show too. It's an uncomfortable well, people coin it as an uncomfortable conversation, but I think it's more of an uncomfortable conversation for people who never have to identify their race. That being what the system of white supremacy was and the way that it was set up or designed. You don't have to identify your race because you don't have to think about your race, right? Or you don't have to think about your race, so therefore you don't really identify your race. Whereas people of color, Black people, Indigenous people have always had to be conscious and cognizant of their race. And it was a great thinking point, or I came across it and I thought, hey, why don't I talk about that briefly on In Black and White? So talk to us about when you've ever had to, if you're watching on whatever platform you're watching on, let us know. When did you have to identify your race? How often do you have to think about your race if you are a white American or European American?
I will say, Rick, I don't know if I've actually done this yet, but I do want to publicly thank you for getting me involved in this conversation. I have learned so much about the Black community and the importance of speaking out and being specifically anti-racist.
Specifically anti-racist? That's the thing?
I will say I do have a lot of fun trolling the extreme right-wing conservative Christians.
Well, hey, please keep it up. Do more.
Just wait. This might offend some people, and I apologize if it does. But sometimes you have to make a point. So just to all my friends that insist in jumping in the face of Black Lives Matter and saying all lives matter, just know 4th of July is 2 days away. And I want you to remember one very important thing. I am going to be posting it on all your statuses that all countries matter.
All countries matter. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've never seen Petty before, that's Petty. And I love every bit of it.
But hopefully it proves a point so we can get these people to stop saying that crap.
Well, Ethan, are they still saying it? I mean, I think we should have by now. I thought we've made it. We've arrived to getting past all lives matter. Like, are people still really combating or retorting Black Lives Matter with all lives matter?
Constantly.
Oh.
Seeing it on my feed every day. And it's like, you can't even post Black Lives Matter without someone having to remind you that all lives matter and they're not actually racist because they're saying all lives matter.
Well, you remember we had a comment from Lola a couple of weeks ago on our show, and she pointed out, I think her petty moment was on 9/11, she's going to refer to all buildings matter. She's going to make sure to post that all buildings matter on 9/11. Yeah. You know,
And
it's
yes, and to Marsha in the comments did say, I mean more racist people, not a specific political party. Yeah, but that's why I was specifically saying extreme conservative Christians. I wasn't addressing all conservatives as a whole.
you know, here's the thing. I maybe it's the different circles that we travel in, Ethan. And one of the biggest reasons for those of you who may not know how In Black and White even came to fruition, it was really based around the premise of Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in the street, and I did not see any white people upset about it. Nobody posted about it. Nobody was this outraged.
I didn't know about it.
And I reached out to Ethan and said, "Hey, we got to talk about this." And your at the time, your visibility, your platform was more geared towards white Americans. So really thought, hey, why not have this conversation? And that's how we got started on this show. Again, our circles might be a little different. I don't see people really saying all lives matter to retort Black Lives Matter. So I thought we've arrived, but clearly we haven't. And I hear that they're still saying it down in Southern Carolina. Jeez. All right, well, that's the South. You know, the things that are going on in our country right now with race understanding, racial equality, being at the forefront of conversations. I know that it could look like where things are happening, things are kind of slowing down. Maybe you're not seeing a lot of this on your feed, you know, anymore. Let me assure you that the fight is still taking place. So we can't take our foot off the gas right now. For those of you that are fighting and speaking up and speaking out, please continue to do so. Please continue to read the literature that's out there and continue to focus on being anti-racist. Non-racism is not a thing anymore. And non-racism is equivalent to complicit with racism. You have to speak up and you have to speak out and call out that behavior. So tonight on our show, we're bringing on a very special guest to join us in this conversation who has a lot of history in political science and even hosts his own show on WVON. You can catch him on Friday nights from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m. He will be joining us. He's joining us. His name, Atiba Buchanan, co-host of the Buchanan and Seaton show. Mr. Atiba, how are you?
I'm excellent. Good, guys. Thank you so much for having me on.
So this is the only consensus for having Atiba on for those of you who are watching. I had to make sure that I put it out there for him. He cannot show me up with his radio voice on our show. He just is not able to. This man has a great radio voice. It's a great show, a lot of great content and discussion, but he will not show me up on our show with that radio voice.
And I certainly won't show you up in humor because you're on point tonight. So excellent.
I try.
Excellent.
Atiba, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and a little bit about your show.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Atiba Buchanan. I host the Buchanan and Seaton show. Again, as you said, on Friday nights, we air on WVON from Friday nights from 9 p.m. until 12 a.m. The show started 5 years ago as a podcast. We were on not intellectual radio. We were on Blog Talk Radio. And the show was originally called We Hear You. And it was a 3-man show. It was me, my friend David Seaton, and he was pivotal because he's actually the person that really got me into politics about, a little over 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And then there was a young lady that had joined us, Rashida Graham Washington. The show evolved. People left. Rashida left. And then we changed the name of the show to Humanity in the Headlines. And so the main thing, and that's always been like the theme of the show, because even when it was called We Hear You, the full moniker was We Hear You, where we find the humanity in the headlines. And so our thing has always been, as a show, to talk about the story behind the headline, the stories behind the statistics. It's easy to get caught up in numbers, whether it's COVID deaths, whether it's the number of people killed by police. But what about the actual trauma that happens in those individual statistics? The inspiration for the show came from a letter that I'd seen on the internet some years ago. A young lady had written, it was an African-American lady, had written a judge an open letter on the internet that had sentenced her father to a life sentence for a non-violent drug offense. And her father was sentenced when she was 2. And when she was 22, she wrote the letter to the judge, and she detailed all the ways that her life had been impacted by not having her father available to her for being locked away for life for a nonviolent drug offense. And when I got a chance to see, when she talked about all the missed birthdays, and she talked about all the, no one around to protect her, and no one around to teach her how to ride a bike, I was like, that's the part that people forget, is what happens behind the statistics. So that's always been our thing. So now and so every time we changed the name of the show, we went to a different platform. So Humanity in the Headlines is on Intellectual Radio. We left Intellectual Radio and we went to WVON, and now it is the Buchanan and Seton show. But again, our thing is to always remind people of our shared humanity.
Which I think is what kind of drove Ethan to start in this business. Wasn't it something along those lines, Ethan? Something along humanitarian.
I just got we don't want to go into my personal views, but let's just say I'm a humanitarian. And people just talking past each other, not seeing eye to eye, taking extreme positions, and I just want to foster healthy dialogue and get people talking, and present the information as accurately as possible, and let people decide for themselves.
Hey, Atiba, you mentioned something too that I think a lot of people still kind of shy away from. At least I find that people are still shying away from it in conversation. You mentioned the trauma, and I think what people have a hard time dealing with, and I'm going to say specifically white Americans who can't wrap their head around systemic and institutional racism, around the idea and the reality of white supremacy, can't understand the trauma that has taken place to an entire community and still takes place to an entire community, several communities, in fact, people of color, indigenous, and Black people. And I'm glad you mentioned, you spoke about that and putting a face to, the statistics that are there. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation with us as well. I got a great recommendation that your history in political awareness and understanding is almost unmatched. So,
well, I don't know if I can live up to that, but we'll see.
I won't tell you.
No pressure, right?
I think the person who said it is a little biased, but that's neither here nor there.
She is. She better be.
So let's jump into a little bit about the whole system when it comes to voting, when it comes to the importance of voting. Where do you stand, and how do you present information to help people understand or gain awareness around voting in general?
Sure. Voting is probably the singular most important thing that we can do. On our show, we promote it all the time. Whatever ails you, whatever your problem is with society in particular, the question is, did you vote on that? Have you voted in your local elections? Have you voted nationally? Unfortunately, in this country, the country that is known for democracy, the great experiment, even in our presidential elections, we are at about 50% voter participation. So 50% of the country that's eligible to vote during the elections bothers to vote. And so we have a cultural problem, we have a systemic problem, and certainly voter suppression laws that have been passed since they've gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 have not helped at all. But even before that happened, again, a lot of people simply feel too hopeless to vote. They feel that there's little to no difference between the two major party system, so why bother? And that has suppressed our voter participation for years. And unfortunately, one party depends on that more than the other.
Sure. Talk to me a little bit about, for people to understand, when you talk about gutting of the Voting Act, what do you mean by that? What took place there, so that people really have an understanding of what happened, and where we are now?
Yeah. So what the Voting Rights Act did, obviously, was bigger than just allowing African Americans and other minority citizens to vote. What it also did was take precautions, because they understood how pervasive individuals that wanted to keep people from voting can be. So there were protections in place. For instance, if a city wanted to drastically reduce the number of polling stations, they could not do so without permission from the federal government. And even if they were trying to pass a law or a rule that wasn't necessarily racist in nature, but had a racist effect, that would be enough for the federal government to step in and say, no, you cannot do that. So it allowed us to not have so much gerrymandering. It allowed us to have more fair elections. When that provision was taken out of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, because what they said, it was kind of a double-edged sword, a circular argument. They were saying, well, we don't have any instances now of voter suppression, so we're going to go ahead and remove it. And it was removed in particular states that had, because it wasn't all over the country, it was mostly in southern states that it had historical problems with voting. When they were able to remove that, the reason that you didn't see the voter suppression was because the rule was in place. But then they took the rule out, and now we've seen since 2013, as we saw, I think it was in Kentucky the other day, right? We saw one polling station for a community of 600,000 people. That type of foolishness would not have been allowed just 7 years ago because of the Voting Rights Act. So we've seen a lot of things happen, unfortunately, since the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. And hopefully we can get politicians to get that back in place. That is of huge importance right now.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I'm listening to you, and I hear that this took place as recently as 2013. And something that I think I find still baffling, and I don't know, you probably remember very recently when the Senate was arguing about still making arguments and debates around federal lynching laws.
Yeah, sure.
To me, it's baffling. Like, I don't understand how this is still a conversation. Like, how are we still talking about lynching as a form of debate for a federal hate crime? Like, why is that even still a conversation in 2020? But yet it's still taking place.
And our good friend Rand Paul was still against it, right? Was it him?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're looking at this and we're saying, all right, we have these systems that are in place. We have these people who are in place that potentially could do something about it. Maybe could do something about it. How do we, as citizens, as people who are putting these people in office, what are some of the things that we need to look for? Where should we be focusing on when it comes to choosing a candidate, deciphering who to vote for, things like that? How do we do that?
All right, so that's a very deep question, but I'm glad you asked it because
here comes his radio voice, Ethan. Here we go.
So, Atiba, are you looking for another show? You're starting to sound better than Rick already.
We're building the network. We are. No, this is not nice.
You guys are hilarious. I love it. So what happens? First of all, let's be thankful that we're in 2020. Let's be thankful, and what I mean by that is, let's be thankful we live in the age of the internet, that we live in the age of Google, because we are in a situation now that whatever information you want to know is as simple as using your fingertips. So if you want to look up a candidate's record on race, and you can do that with any candidate. As a matter of fact, there was I got notes for the 2020 election, right? For the Democratic primary, the CURE, the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, they did a racial justice scorecard for everyone that was running for the Democratic nomination for president. And they gave every single candidate, from Elizabeth Warren to Joe Biden to Bernie Sanders on down, a scorecard. And the scorecard was based on past comments that they've made, bills that they've signed, and of course, what they are proposing as president. And everyone got a score and everyone got a grade from A- to F. As a matter of fact, they also did Donald Trump as well, because he's running on he was the presumed nominee for the Republicans. And of course, he got an F on race relations. But those things are right. Those things are right at your fingertips. We spent a lot of time debating whether or not Joe Biden is going to be good for Black people come 2020, assuming he wins. And certainly we can talk about his history because it's there for us to see. But also, I wonder, on my show, I've even asked people, have they ever, as we're debating Joe Biden, did anyone take 2 minutes to look at his platform on his website? Because he has a Black agenda on his website. And very few people ever take the time to look. So unfortunately, we live in a country that people live by the soundbite. We even have a president who cannot be bothered to read his daily briefings. And he's the president. So we have that, and the average American who is now in a position to have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet, they don't necessarily have the time nor the energy to invest in trying to figure out who's about what. The other problem is most people are not single issue voters. Even as an African American, I am not a single issue voter. So the person that I may choose, like Joe Biden, I'll vote for him because he's the Democratic nominee, and I think the Democratic Party speaks more to my values. But however, he's not the perfect candidate at all. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, we get caught up, especially as Democrats, in making candidates pass a purity test when we need to be a little more strategic in our thinking and think about how we can use that person, regardless of their checkered past, to advance what we want to do in the future. I can give you a perfect example.
Please.
Just in 2019, in February of 2019, the buzz was Ralph Northam in blackface.
I remember.
Do we remember that? The governor of Virginia.
Of Virginia, yep. Well, who was a Democrat?
He was a Democrat. Mm-hmm. It was found out that he had taken some blackface pictures in college. He purports not to know where they came from, or what have you. And if you remember this, and I know you do because it was funny, we were this close to seeing Ralph Northam's best Michael Jackson imitation.
Yes.
Right? Until his wife said, hey, time out. That's not appropriate. But he was going to do it.
Yes.
My point is, we have gone from that to as recently as April of 2020, Ralph Northam signing the law to get rid of Confederate monuments in the state of Virginia, which houses over 220 Confederate monuments. He's also passed the law to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2026. So again, here's a person who by his past maybe was disqualified, but we were able to use him in that position to help advance things for people of color and all Americans, because people of color aren't the only people benefiting from a raised minimum wage by raising the floor.
Very true.
So there's an example of someone that probably wouldn't pass the purity test, but because we live in 2020 and we were able to hold him accountable and put his feet to the fire, and we didn't kick him out of office like we did our good friend Al out of the Senate, the funny Al Franken, right? Oh. One of the biggest mistakes we've ever made, right? So he stood his ground, he stayed in, but because of that, we were able to hold his feet to the fire and get something productive out of it. And that's the way we need to start, especially as Democrats, looking at politics, because Republicans do it all the time. They hate Donald Trump, but he's a means to an end, and so they tolerate him. So we have to do more of that. We can't make everyone just pass this 100% purity test because that person doesn't exist.
No, and it's never going to.
Touch base on something real quick, just so it doesn't look like we're asserting that Donald Trump doesn't read his briefings. I'm going to actually use a Ben Shapiro quote right now when he was addressing trying to defend Donald Trump sharing that video of someone screaming "White Power." He said, "And we know Donald Trump doesn't read his briefings. Trump has the attention span of a gnat. He will literally not read presidential briefings on his desk. He wants bullet points, and then those bullet points he wants shortened." So this is not something that we're just saying to bash Donald Trump. This is coming from the Republican Party as well too. It is known that Donald Trump is not a fan of reading.
Right.
But Donald Trump said as much when he was before he became president. Because what happens is once you become the nominee, you are then subject to the presidential briefings. So once Joe Biden becomes the actual nominee come the convention, he will start getting presidential briefings. So when back in 2016, when Donald Trump became the nominee officially and began getting bombarded with all this information, that's when he came out and said, this is too much. I can't digest all that. Just tell me the points. So he said it himself. He doesn't like to read. We're not bashing the man. It came out of his own mouth.
Yeah. There's so much there, and I don't really want to dive too much into when it comes to the presidential election and our current state that we're in. It speaks volumes to where we are racially with the racially charged environment that we have. But I will say, I think that you made a point earlier, 50% of eligible voters aren't voting. The presidential election is that election that I think, well, probably both of them, but it's more this popularity contest type of a layout, right? There is an imperativeness when it comes to the voting of your congressional members, your legislators, right, your senators, and your local officials and your local leaders. I think that's where the biggest impact to what's going to affect you directly is important. How are we to get? Because I think I would venture to say that Bernie Sanders just didn't really win because the base that he appealed to, being this particular age demographic, is part of that 50% that does not get out and vote. How do you get people to understand the importance of voting and how to really get out there and look at your candidate or the candidates that are there to weigh what's going to be the best candidate? And that weighing thing I'm going to get back to in just a second. But your opinion on how do you get people to understand the importance of that local election, your legislators, those individuals?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, man, honestly, I wish I had a better answer, because this is the sad reality, and I hate to be such a bummer, but the 50% that we talked about that does bother to vote, I'm only talking about presidential elections. As the elections become smaller, the numbers become more paltry. So we remember Barack Obama won by a landslide in 2008. And when he came into the presidency in 2009, he had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. What happened in 2010? He lost them because it wasn't a presidential election. Because people that normally get all excited about the president, that unfortunately don't understand how politics work, because in their minds, I made you president, you fix it. They'd like to have a singular focus as opposed to having the focus of trying to figure out which 500 congressmen and which 99 senators or 100 senators they're going to vote for. So again, we have people that as the elections get smaller, they become less interested. And so the question becomes, how do we do it?
Right.
Unfortunately, the Republican Party does an excellent job of getting their propaganda out there, and one of their propaganda tools is creating a general mistrust of government. So you've never seen people at this point mistrust government the way that a large percentage of the population does. I'm not sure how old you guys are, but I am old enough to. Do you remember the Surgeon General C. Everett Koop?
No.
He was under Reagan. That's all right.
Let me just say this, Atiba, you don't look much older than us. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Don't reveal my age.
I'll be 47 in November.
Oh.
So
yeah. About like 9 years.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
But when I was younger, the first Surgeon General I can recall who was on the TV nationally all the time was C. Everett Koop, and he served under Ronald Reagan. He was a older white guy. He had this beard, but no mustache, right? And when C. Everett Koop came on TV to say something about public health, people listened. If 30 years ago, C. Everett Koop came on television and said, we all need to wear masks, guess what? 95% of people, I promise you, would be wearing masks. It hasn't always been like this. And so the past 30 years since Ronald Reagan, Republicans have done a masterful job of creating this distrust of government. If you remember, Ronald Reagan, his most famous slogan was, the problem wasn't the people, it was the government. That's what held people back from being successful, was a government that was in their way. So right now we have people that do not trust government. They do not trust media, because media has not always been this way. We're in 24-hour news cycles. To the media's discredit, because of the 24-hour news cycle, there's much more pressure for them to create news as opposed to just letting the news be.
Even if it's not.
Right. So we have distrust in government, distrust in media. And so people are less inclined to believe the system works. And if there is distrust in the system, how can we get people motivated to vote? And then on top of all that, and I'll be done. On top of all that, when you look at the voter suppression and you see every story of people having to wait 6 hours to vote, 7 hours to vote, how is that going to inspire people to vote, to get off their butt and then vote for their local elections if they've got to take a day off to do it? We've got a lot of work to do, man, as a country.
Listen, especially in this global pandemic that we're faced with in our country, I don't think that, I think that we're up against, especially with the states that are banning or not allowing staying at home or absentee ballot to be an option during a pandemic. People are scared to go out and vote, but
rightfully so.
Exactly, and especially with people out there that don't want to wear masks. But that's another conversation for another time.
May I ask a question from our audience, Atiba?
Yeah.
I'm going to put it on screen. Tina, do you think that if we stop separating ourselves by color or sexual preference that we could move on? I feel that we keep saying I'm this or that, and this is what separates us. Can't we all just be humans?
And apart, okay.
Go ahead, please, because that was for you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, unfortunately, the short answer is no, because people pick and choose when they just want to be human. So usually as an African American, I get this a lot. African Americans say, people say to African Americans all the time, why is it everything has to be about race? Usually, if there's a story that promotes something good that an African American did, the first African American to do this, or the first African American to do that. And it's unfortunate we're still having first of those in 2020. But usually when those stories pop up, I see a lot of responses as, why does everything have to be about race? But if an African American does something wrong, guess what all the comments are about? The race. Because that guy didn't rob that liquor store because he was destitute and needed money. He robbed that liquor store because he was black. He raped that woman because he was black. That Muslim did that because they are a terrorist. So the first thing we have to do is, if we're going to decide that we're all just going to be human, then we have to make that the playing field all the time. We can't just pick and choose when we're going to be human. The problem is not that people are using politics to advance their particular group narrative, especially when you're talking about group narratives of groups that are in the Constitution that cannot be discriminated against. In other words, if you're making up some group that is not a group that cannot be discriminated against, that's different. But if you're identifying yourself as something that is protected by the Constitution, as in you cannot fire this person because they're gay, because they're black, those are protections. Because of their religion, those are protections. If you have those protections, then there's nothing wrong with you having a platform around that protection. That's my.
And even furthermore, to your point and to that question, I think that if in the event we start just looking at things as humans, and what a wonderful world it would be if we could, but unfortunately, because we don't, we have to observe what's going to impact all of our communities as humans, right? When it comes to how we're voting. And I think that the unfortunate part about voting, and I want to read a comment here in a minute, Ethan, from Cynthia about not getting her vote to neither him nor Biden. I'll get to that in a second. But I think that what happens is if we start voting within our own self-interest rather than what potentially could be the good of the majority or the good of the people who actually need these systems or systems in place, or this candidate who potentially can offer systems for people to be able to progress. If we just look at it as all of us being human beings, then we'll probably miss out on who are the people that are really going to need and benefit from this person being a candidate, being in office, or being in this position, right? I understand the need for looking at the different communities that are represented and trying to get an understanding of what those what the impact is going to look like for those communities. We've always had to do it for white America, right? Any candidate that we put in office is always going to be some type of a benefit for white Americans at some level. I say this all the time. Racism it's bipartisan, right? It extends into both parties. Democrat and Republican have had systemic racism weaved throughout their party at some facet, in some shape or form. So if in the event we're going to start looking at candidates for the human race, which we don't, but if we did, then we'd have to start looking at which candidate is going to better benefit the entire population, each of those demographics, instead of just the predominant or just the majority.
Yeah, agreed. And we'd also have to get people to appreciate the benefit of the laws that are passed, regardless of who passes them. For instance, how many people, in particular in southern states, could really use some Obamacare?
Hey, listen, I love the fact that you rolled your eyes when you said that, because it's like, yet again, here we go, these southern states. Right. No shade to the southerners, though. No shade.
No, because here's my point. There are people in Kentucky, people in Mississippi. These are the people that have the worst health outcomes, the worst educational outcomes in the country, right? And they have governors who had an opportunity to expand Medicaid, to bring in tens, hundreds of thousands more people that didn't have insurance to get insurance under Obamacare. And because the black guy passed it, they refused it. So there's a law that affects everyone, that impacts and benefits everyone. And there are people that don't want it to this day because it's called Obamacare. The fact that we know in polling that when people look at the individual benefits of the Affordable Care Act, and when it's called the Affordable Care Act, people say, yes, that sounds fantastic. And you roll out those same benefits, but call it Obamacare, and then it becomes a problem. That tells you everything you need to know about where we are as a country.
Well, I can agree with that. I want to bring up this comment from Cynthia McDonald about, but I can't give my vote to either him nor Biden. And I want to address this comment just because, and Atiba, you're more than welcome to as well. You made a point earlier when we talked about holding our people, our candidates who are in office, holding their feet to the fire, right? Her comment reads this. It says, but I can't give my vote to either him, speaking of Trump, nor Biden, because I feel both of them do not serve my interest as a Black American that descends from chattel slavery. I want to get your feedback on that, because, again, as you mentioned, if any event we withhold our vote, and I think a lot of people have this mindset that, you know what, neither of these candidates are serving my best interests, so why should I vote for either one of them? What does that do to the system? What does that do to the setup of the candidates? What's the outcome when that happens, especially when we don't give that politician a chance to step in and, as we did in Virginia, hold their feet to the fire to make the changes that we need that benefit us?
Yes, I'm going to go back to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the most flawed human being to ever grace the political stage. No, really. And
I agree. I'm with you. I'm sure.
He is. So why does he have the popularity that he has? When you look at evangelicals, right? These are people that are supposedly Christians. And we saw him in his campaign go to, I think it was Liberty University.
Oh, I missed that. I try not to follow him because I lose brain cells every time.
As soon as I say this, you'll remember. He went to Liberty University, a Christian school, and he said, "Oh, it's right here in 2 Corinthians." Right?
No, I don't remember. No, I'm telling you. Listen, Atiba, I do not listen. I can't, because every time I hear him speak, when I hear him speak, I lose brain cells, bro. I do. You know, I'm at this point now. Not to interrupt real quick. I'm at this point now where I would almost rather hear Pence speak, and we know, and I understand where I'm going to end up as a Black gay man if Pence is in office, but I would almost rather hear Pence speak than hear Trump grace this microphone ever again. I really lose brain cells.
And that's my point, because he said that because I know you're a atheist, Ethan, and so the book of the Bible is called 2 Corinthians,
right? And
he said, and this is a Bible school. This is Liberty University. Everybody in this school is taking some religious. They all know what the name of the book of the scripture is. And he said 2 Corinthians, and everybody in that audience giggled quietly to themselves and voted for him, because it was clear at that point he'd never picked up a Bible in his life, that he wasn't a Christian, but it didn't matter because they knew he was going to appoint judges that would overturn Roe versus Wade. And that was their issue. So Republicans just look at their issue. He's not a conservative, but conservatives knew if they presented him with a tax bill that he's going to sign it, showing those. So because they view him as a means to an end, as flawed as he is, he's not even patriotic. This is a guy that came up with bone spurs to prevent himself from serving. This is a man who's allowed U.S. troops to be sniped by the Taliban in Afghanistan on a Russian bounty. How can he talk about NFL players not being patriotic? I'm sorry?
No, I just wanted to point out that this actually goes back to his briefings and refusing to read them, because as stated by even his own party, he did get the briefings, he didn't read them. Now there is a mixed message on whether he was told it specifically, but he was given the briefings and he chose not to do anything to protect our U.S. soldiers. But
which is completely consistent. Let's take that out of it. Let's just go back about a year and a half ago to Helsinki. Can we just go back there where he stood next to Vladimir Putin? And when he was asked directly, do you believe your intelligence agencies or do you believe Vladimir Putin? He said, I don't see why it would be Russia.
Listen,
so my only point in saying all that is to say that Donald Trump is as flawed a Republican as there is. He's not a conservative. He's not a Christian. He's not patriotic. But what he is willing to do is advance each of their individual important issues. And so they use him. And all I'm suggesting is we begin to do the same thing. I'm not suggesting that we put in a shyster like Trump. I am saying let's stop with the purity test and put the people in office that say they're going to do something and then make them do it. Because if you don't vote for them at all, you're completely invisible to them.
Well, and I will say, this is the first election where I am beyond torn. Now, to be clear, I was ready to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Now, when he first came on, now keep in mind, I was more conservative at that point still. When he first came on, I viewed him as the equivalent of, and I don't mean this, I'm just using this as a metaphor, as lobbing a grenade at the White House. And what I mean by that is he's saying F the system.
Shake it up.
He's going to be the guy to shake it up.
Yeah.
But then all I had to do is hear that man keep talking. Like, I don't need to point to a single policy. I can point to him as just a abysmal human being, in my opinion. And the fact that much of his base, not the entirety of it, but much of his base is just fanatic and they don't listen. I mean, this is a person that drank a glass of water one-handed and received applause. And he proceeded to spend the next 20 minutes of his campaign talking about walking down a ramp.
It had to run.
What are they missing, or what am I missing? Because I get very confused as to why people still stand by this man. Because to me, all you have to do is watch him uninterrupted and routinely speak, and that should be enough to be like, hey, this guy's kind of.
I think the same thing, Ethan. And I cannot fathom. I cannot fathom at this point, because of the several actions, and I think you might have seen on my page, for those of you who follow me, very recently, and my sister had to address me, like she actually put her foot in my ass, was like, why would you do this to yourself? I asked the question, why would people at this stage in his leadership and all that, this was like maybe a couple of weeks ago, how could people still support this man as a leader? And it was remarkable to get the answers that I got. And all of those who still supported refer to what he did prior to where we are now and his financial impact. And what that told me was a couple of things. One, the people who are still supporting him think that there's a financial gain that they're going to get for themselves. That's the first thing. The other thing was, as you indicated, there were people who got behind him. And remember, we talked about this on our show last week, who get behind him because they want to say F politics, right? They want to say they want to shake up how politics are done. And politics is normal, and do away with the way that what is it, political correctness or whatever that was. And I said, what do I hear when people say things like that? What I hear is you want to say the N-word. What I hear you want to say, when you say you want to shake up politics and you don't want to deal with the non-offensive-ness or the political correctness that's out there, you don't want to abide by that anymore. What I interpret that to mean is you just want to say the N-word whenever you can towards Black people. Outside of that, here's my example of what you do when you want to shake up politics. We have a mayor in Chicago. Shout out to Madam Mayor Lori Lightfoot. # Uncle LL is what I call her.
Love it.
Uncle LL stepped in and shook up Chicago politics as normal. She stepped in on her first day of being inaugurated and said, all right, so aldermen, you no longer get a veto. That's how this is going to work, right? She said, police, CPD, y'all cool. I'm not going to use y'all for my security. I'm going to get my own. And she shook up Chicago politics, but she did it in such a way that she remained with class and dignity, right? People may not like her, but there are movements that she has made to shake up politics. People who are still supporting this individual, Ethan, I think that would be the answer to why you find people still supporting him. Small base, but still going on.
Well, I think I do understand why some, I want to choose my words carefully here. I don't agree with it, but I think the majority that do support him are missing, are just missing a lot. And I don't want to just sit here and bash the guy.
Yeah, no, right, no.
It's no secret that
No, he's worthy of bashing. I'm sorry.
I also
bashing. Go ahead.
Well, very clear that I don't like Biden either. I think that guy sucks. But I am right now at a crossroads where I'm like, I don't believe in the two-party system. I think it needs to be done away with. We should have 4 to 5 choices. But I'm like, well, if I have to vote for the lesser of the two evils, it may be Biden. But it's so hard for me to do that because I don't think Biden is a intelligent individual, and I don't think he's a good person. But sorry, Atiba, you're the guest. I'd like to let you.
Every opinion is important, and I appreciate what you said because you represent what a lot of people feel in this moment, and that's what a lot of people felt in 2016. That's very similar to what was said about Hillary Clinton at the time. So here's what we do know. Here's the difference between 2016 and 2020, though. Here's the difference. In 2016, we suspected that Donald Trump would be problematic. In 2020, we know. So there's a difference. Now we understand the threat that he represents to our entire democracy. He is a specific and unique threat to this country. If there was one drop of American blood spilled with this bounty issue,
if it was Obama,
oh my God! Do you remember?
Again,
do we remember just a few years ago that we spent how many millions of dollars and how many hearings on 4 dead Americans 7,000 miles away? We have 130,000 dead Americans and counting on our own shores, and we're having a serious conversation as to whether or not he can stay there.
Hey, speaking of that 130,000, that cough that you just did, where's your mask? I need you to get that checked out. It's still going on. It's still a thing.
That's just from running my mouth.
That's fine. All right. Well, listen. I know we don't have a lot of time left, Atiba, but I know that there were some things that you wanted to kind of cover too as well. That you wanted to get into a little bit. Was there something else that you wanted to touch on before?
We're at the end of it now. What I wanted to kind of open with was the quote by Lee Atwater, because what I did want people to understand about white supremacy in politics is that it's ingrained. It's there. It's part of it, and it is far more pervasive than just picking a few candidates in a few cities or states. The reason his quote is so important is because what he lays out is that we changed our language. Before we had this offensive language we could run on. And then when that became unpopular, because we still wanted the same net effect of oppression, because we don't have a problem with the effect, people had a problem with the language, right? So he says, instead of saying the N-word, we can say tax cut. We can use this benign language that people cannot ascribe to race, but still get the oppressive results that we want. Lee Atwater He was.
What was the quote?
Sure. So the quote says,
just so anybody that's watching could potentially be a little triggering, but I'm familiar with the quote, but I definitely want the quote read for people who are watching.
Absolutely. He starts out by saying, you can start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is a part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or another. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger, end quote.
So then he's the author of Southern Strategy, correct?
Right. And just bear in mind, I just want to give a little bit of timeline of his life. The man wasn't even born until 1951. He was the campaign manager for the 41st president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, and the chairman at the time of the Republican National Committee. So someone with that mindset is running the campaign for someone who was just president 4 presidents ago, and he was in charge of the Republican National Committee. So again, that's how
it's very recent.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's very recent.
Yeah.
So that's my point is when you're trying to identify racist policies, they're never going to be blatant. The main problem people have with Donald Trump isn't his racism. It's his overtness. People have no problem with covert racism. They have a problem with overt racism. You can be covert. You cannot be overt. And that's where Donald Trump crosses the line. But it's not the racism. It's the overtness of it.
Yeah. Well, hey, Atiba, listen, we have to wrap up and get out of here, man. Thank you so much for being on the show with us again. Let everybody know where they can find you, because I definitely think that this is a conversation that probably can come up again. How can people locate your show and locate you?
So again, our main show, you can catch us on Friday nights, WVON AM 1690 and WVON.com. It is an iHeartRadio station as well. You can follow our Twitter at The B. Seaton Show, the letter B, SEATON Show, The B. Seaton Show. And we love you to follow us on Twitter and take a listen to our show on Friday nights.
Sounds good, sir. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. You be safe. You be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Meeting you. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you, Ethan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cynthia, 13%.
Oh, we're about to we're going to get joined here by our next up on YFNA News. The 13% is kicking off their show, and they're joining us here for a little bit to talk a little bit about what they're going to be discussing tonight. So, Cynthia, how did you enjoy In Black and White tonight?
Oh, I enjoyed it immensely. Your guest is a wealth of information. I so appreciate weaving in Lee Atwater. You know, you always never know when you are going to have a conversation with Lee Atwater and wine. Who knows? But, you know, that was a great way to weave it in.
Hey, listen, and he talked about in the pre-show, he wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit. And I was like, go ahead and throw that in there. Cynthia McDonald, one of the hosts of 13%, the 13% coming up here on YFNA News next. Tell us what you got going on, what you're talking about tonight.
So we're actually going to be speaking about systemic racism, institutional racism, and the cost that is placed on a certain 13% of the population in the United States. So I think this was actually birthed out of a few conversations that I know that I have and that the our co-host has had on the last debate that was on. I don't know if it was on YFNA News? The debate with Chris.
I think it was.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, you know, there is an issue where a certain sect of the population does not understand or agree or know that institutional racism, systemic racism actually still exists, is still pervasive, is still active in our society. And so we're going to talk about that this evening and give very clear examples of the persistence of systemic racism.
Hey, listen, I can't wait for that. So those of you who are watching here on In Black and White, please join us in just a moment. We're going to take a bit of a break here, switch on over, and get into the 13%. Follow us on YFNA News on YouTube. Make sure that you're subscribed, that you like this video, share it on your social media platforms so people can get involved in the conversation. And finally, ensure that you have that little alarm clicked so that you can get alerts for all of the notifications when the shows go live.
And thank you to our patrons, Marsha Ortega and Best Name Ever. And then I feel like we're going to have to do a part 2 to this episode because I don't think we lived up to the title of Attacking White Supremacy. So I honestly, I feel like we need to.
I am down for part 2, white 2,
yeah.
Part 2.
Yeah, part 2, white 2, breaking down white supremacy. Yes.
And actually attack it, and that's what we need to do is attack white supremacy.
Hey, I think that we can get some really good guests, some additional good guests on too as well. But big thanks to Atiba Buchanan for joining us on our show tonight. Up next, Cynthia McDonald with Richard Graves on the 13% here on YFNA News. Did we come up with an end slogan yet for
yes.
our tagline?
Remember, and as long as there's racism,
there's In Black and White.